middle-aged man with a struggling construction business, agrees to a green card marriage with a much younger woman, Alina, recently arrived from Eastern Europe. The deal is clear: money for marriage. But during the rushed courthouse ceremony, Daniel senses something unsettling in her eyes. Less desperation, more calculation. Let me know where you're watching from and drop a comment below before we dive into this unforgettable story. The town of Wrentham, Massachusetts, wasn't the kind of place where secrets festered easily. Its streets were narrow, the houses old, and neighbors knew each other's routines like the ticking of a clock. That was both a comfort and a curse for Daniel Cooper, who had lived there most of his life. Divorced for nearly a decade, Daniel was the kind of man people waved to without ever asking how he was really doing. He owned a small construction business that was barely staying afloat, thanks in part to aging equipment, unpredictable contracts, and a back still recovering from years of labor. His days passed in a steady rhythm, early mornings, long hours, and lonely dinners with the TV humming in the background. So when Alina appeared, Daniel's life, once colorless and measured, took a turn he hadn't expected. They met through an online forum, discreet, coded, and transactional. She was 28, sharp-eyed, and had arrived from Eastern Europe only weeks earlier. Her English was passable, but her gaze was fluent in survival. She was looking for a marriage, not a romance, a green card, not a partner. The terms were discussed plainly: money for the legal arrangement, no strings attached, a clean and quiet process. Daniel, desperate for a financial lifeline and perhaps a little human closeness, though he'd never admit it, agreed. They stood in the courthouse on a Tuesday morning that smelled of disinfectant and linoleum polish. No family, no friends, just the clerk and the quiet shuffling of papers. Alina wore a gray coat with the tag still stitched under her wrist. Daniel had on his least wrinkled flannel shirt and tried not to meet the clerk's eyes. When it was time to say "I do," Daniel hesitated, not out of conscience, but because when he looked into Alina's face, he saw something he couldn't name. She didn't look frightened or even particularly hopeful. There was no gratitude, no nervous laughter. Her lips were steady, her hands motionless. What he saw or thought he saw was calculation. Cold, clinical, like someone flipping through options and choosing the least terrible one. It unsettled him, though he said nothing. After they signed the papers, they walked out into the biting wind. She pulled her coat tighter, her expression unreadable. "You have a car?" she asked simply. He nodded and led her to the old Dodge pickup with rust curling along the doors. The silence between them was thick but not awkward, more like two people waiting for a script to begin. As they drove, she stared out the window, her fingers twitching slightly in her lap. She didn't ask about his house, his life, or his past, and he didn't ask about hers. The drive home was only 10 minutes, but it felt longer. The landscape blurred by: bare trees, gas stations, small shops with flickering neon signs. When they pulled up to his modest home on a side street with cracked pavement and overgrown hedges, she offered a quiet "thank you" and stepped out. Daniel noticed she didn't look around curiously like someone stepping into a new life. Instead, she moved like someone entering a temporary shelter, cautious and detached. Inside, he showed her the basics: the kitchen, the bathroom, the spare bedroom she'd be using. She nodded, taking mental notes but asking no questions. That first night, they didn't speak much. He made pasta, offered her a plate, which she accepted with a polite smile. She ate quickly and cleared her dishes before retreating to her room. He heard the lock click behind her. That night, Daniel lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling fan creaking gently above him. He told himself this was just business. It didn't matter who she was or what she had seen in life. But the unease in his chest wouldn't settle. He had expected desperation, a woman eager to please, to ingratiate herself, maybe even to manipulate with kindness. What he hadn't expected was this quiet steeliness. Something in her posture, the way she kept her eyes just a second too long on doorways and windows, gave him pause. She wasn't here because she was lost. She was here because she was hiding, and Daniel, whether he liked it or not, had just given her a place to hide. As the days unfolded, that unease became part of his routine. Alina kept to herself, never venturing far from the house. She cleaned, without being asked, cooked only for herself, and declined his occasional attempts at small talk. Her phone calls were short and spoken in a language Daniel couldn't place: Slavic, maybe Romanian or Bulgarian. One night, while brushing his teeth, he heard the sound of quiet sobbing through the thin wall between their rooms. He stood there frozen, toothbrush still in hand. By the time he knocked softly on her door and asked if everything was okay, the crying had stopped. "I'm fine," came her voice, flat and steady. "Just tired." She never cried again. Least not when he could hear her. Weeks passed like pages turned in a book you're not sure you're enjoying. Daniel worked during the day and came home to a house that no longer felt entirely his. She was always polite, never warm. He told himself it didn't matter, but every once in a while he'd catch her looking at the front door as if listening for something, waiting for a knock that never came. Rentham remained quiet, unchanged. The neighbors, curious but polite, started asking subtle questions at the hardware store and the diner. "New tenant? She your niece? She okay?" Daniel offered vague replies. The truth was, he didn't know who she was, not really. And something told him, deep in his gut, that it was better not to ask. Still, at night, when he passed her room and saw the faint glow of her lamp under the door, he couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay behind that locked knob. And more importantly, whether they'd stay there for long. The days following the courthouse ceremony blurred together in a haze of unfamiliar routines and quiet tensions as Alina moved into Daniel Cooper's modest home in that sleepy Massachusetts town. She arrived with only 2 battered suitcases and a small lamp wrapped carefully in a faded towel, the kind of lamp that seemed to carry the weight of memories far heavier than its simple brass frame. Daniel stood on the front porch watching her step down from the cab onto the cracked concrete walk. The sun was low, casting long, lazy shadows across the tired lawn, the grass still stubbornly brown from the cold winter that had just released its grip. He expected desperation, or maybe fear, but Alina moved with an ease and purpose that unsettled him. She was polite, yes, but there was a coolness beneath the surface, a kind of precision that felt rehearsed, like she was playing a role she had perfected long ago. She called him Mr. Cooper for the first few days, her accent thick but not broken, and he had to ask her to call him Daniel. That small concession brought a brief, almost shy smile, but didn't soften the distance she maintained. She unpacked methodically, folding each piece of clothing with exactness, stacking shoes heel to toe inside the small closet, placing the lamp gently on the nightstand in what was now her room, the guest room. Daniel had insisted they sleep in separate rooms. It was part of the arrangement, part of the unspoken contract they'd made, money in exchange for a green card, a marriage of convenience. He told himself that was all there was to it. But the lock on her bedroom door told a different story. He noticed it first on the 3rd night, the quiet click as she secured the door behind her. That sound echoed in his mind long after the house settled into silence. One night, maybe a week after she arrived, he woke to the softest of sounds, muffled sobbing that seemed to seep through the walls. The house was still, the usual creaks and groans absent, but that quiet, heartbreaking sound pulled him from sleep. He got up carefully, not wanting to alarm her or himself, and stood outside her locked door. He knocked gently, whispering her name, but the sobbing stopped immediately. When she finally answered, her voice was steady, distant. "I'm fine. Please go back to sleep." He wanted to press to offer comfort, but the finality in her words stopped him. He returned to bed with a pounding heart, the image of her sitting alone in the dark carved into his thoughts. As days passed, Daniel found himself observing her more closely. Alina avoided sunlight, her curtains drawn tightly during the day. She stayed mostly in her room, cooking simple meals alone, stews, boiled vegetables, soups flavored with unfamiliar spices. She never touched the whiskey or beer he kept in the fridge, not even when he casually offered. She didn't watch television or listen to the radio. The silence she maintained in the house was almost physical, a presence that pressed against Daniel's skin. The neighbors noticed her, of course. Mrs. Gilroy, a kindly widow across the street, gave Daniel a look the morning after Alina moved in that said without words, "Who is she?" Daniel avoided their questions, their sideways glances, and felt a new kind of embarrassment settle deep in his bones. His life, once ordinary and simple, had become a stage where every glance and whisper threatened to expose his secret. One afternoon, coming home earlier than expected from a supply run, he overheard her on the phone, speaking quickly in a language he couldn't recognize. The words tumbled out fast, urgent and clipped. When she saw him at the door, she ended the call abruptly and smiled, a smile too quick, too forced. "Just a work call," she said. "A friend asking about a job." Daniel nodded but felt a chill creep up his spine. That night, unable to sleep, he wandered down to the kitchen and found her sitting alone in the dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the oven clock. She was staring out the window, lost in thought, a half-drunk cup of tea forgotten, on the counter beside her. He asked if she was all right, and she shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Sometimes the past follows you, even across an ocean." Those words hung in the air like a warning, a hint of the hidden weight she carried. She didn't say more and retreated to her locked room, leaving Daniel with a growing sense of unease. He began to wonder not just who she was, but what she was running from, or hiding. The house felt smaller, the silence heavier. There was something in her presence that unsettled him, something that whispered of secrets too dangerous to share. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself it was none of his business, that this was their deal and nothing more. But, deep down, Daniel knew the stranger living in his house was far more complicated than a simple arrangement. The lock on her door was a barrier not just of wood and metal, but of trust and fear. And somewhere inside, he feared the walls were closing in on both of them, drawing them into a story neither of them could yet see the end of. In the quiet routine that had settled over Daniel's small house, certain subtle disturbances began to gnaw at the edges of his awareness, like tiny cracks in a carefully painted wall. Alina maintained her distance, her politeness never waning, but an invisible barrier seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. The house, once familiar, felt foreign, as if the very air inside held fragments of a life Daniel could not reach. It was during one of those ordinary days, the kind that stretch long and quiet in the middle of the week, that he first noticed something odd, a scarf hanging on the back of a chair in the living room. The scarf was delicate, made of fine fabric, and it carried a faint scent that struck Daniel deeply. It was a soft, powdery smell, something like the gentle fragrance of a baby's skin or the scent of freshly washed linens from a nursery. He ran his fingers over the material, wondering why it was there, who it belonged to. Alina didn't mention, it never spoke of any children, but the scarf was a silent clue that whispered of another life beyond the modest walls of his home. Curiosity, once faint and polite, grew bolder. One evening, while Alina was out running errands, Daniel found himself drawn toward her laptop, sitting closed and unobtrusive on the kitchen counter. It was the kind of laptop that could easily disappear into a bag, the screen slightly smudged, from use. His heart thudded in his chest as he hesitated, then tapped the power button. The login screen appeared, and by some quirk of memory or luck, the password came to him. The date she had arrived, the day of their ceremony. He pressed enter and felt a strange mix of guilt and relief when the desktop appeared. What he saw next was a folder buried deep among the files labeled simply Nadia. His breath caught. Nadia. The name echoed through his thoughts like a key unlocking a door to a hidden room. Inside the folder were photos, blurry and grainy, mostly black and white, showing a little girl with bright eyes and an uncertain smile. The images were worn, faded at the edges, as if they had traveled through time and distance to reach this place. Alongside the pictures were drafts of emails, carefully written but never sent. The messages were addressed to someone named Nadia, but the words were hesitant, the sentences broken and awkward, clearly translated from another language. Alina was writing to her, pleading, explaining, promising. The tone was desperate but controlled, a quiet cry for connection that never found its way across the digital divide. Daniel read lines that spoke of longing, of fear, of a mother's promise to find her child again. He felt a lump rise in his throat, a mix of sorrow and confusion. Why hadn't she told him about this? Why keep such a profound part of her life hidden? The questions circled endlessly in his mind as he closed the laptop carefully and replaced it exactly where he found it. But the folder was only the beginning. Over the following days, Daniel noticed other signs, small but unsettling. A set of unfamiliar phone numbers saved in her contacts, calls at odd hours, conversations in a language he could not understand. Sometimes the phone would ring, and Alina would answer with a quiet urgency, her voice dropping to whispers that Daniel couldn't catch. When he asked, she smiled briefly and said, "It's just old friends." But the look in her eyes told a different story, one of worry and caution. At night, Daniel lay awake listening to the faint sounds of her typing. Emails. Her whispered words carried across the dark room, a language foreign to him but heavy with emotion. The distance between them grew not out of anger, but out of the walls she built around herself, walls made of secrets and shadows. One afternoon, as Daniel was sorting through some papers in the living room, he found a small envelope tucked behind, a stack of bills. It was worn and creased, the edges soft from being handled repeatedly. The envelope was addressed to Mara, a name Daniel did not recognize, written in a shaky hand. Inside, a letter unfolded with shaky lines of English, clumsy and heartfelt. It spoke of mistakes and regrets, apologies and warnings. The writer begged Mara to stay hidden, warned her that they were watching again. The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been cut off mid-sentence. Daniel held the fragile paper in his hands, a silent testament to a past filled with fear and betrayal. Each new discovery pulled him deeper into the tangled web of Alina's life, a world so far removed from his own that it seemed almost unreal. Yet the evidence was there, scars not on skin but on the edges of her daily existence, pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to glimpse. He felt a strange protectiveness rising inside him, a shift from the transactional to something more complicated and urgent. This woman, this stranger in his house, was carrying burdens that could no longer be ignored or kept at arm's length. And somewhere beyond the locked doors and whispered conversations lay the answer to a question Daniel didn't yet know how to ask. Who was Nadia, and why was her name written into the hidden corners of Alina's life? As he sat alone that evening, the house settling into silence once more, Daniel understood that the simple arrangement they had agreed to was unraveling. What began as a green card marriage was becoming something far more complex, an entanglement of past secrets, desperate hopes, and a hidden world that would soon demand to be faced. It was an ordinary morning when the knock came at the door, sharp, unexpected, and carrying a weight that immediately set Daniel's nerves on edge. He was sipping his coffee, the sunlight slanting through the kitchen window, when the sound interrupted the quiet hum of the house. Alina, seated at the table scrolling through her phone, looked up with a subtle tightening around her eyes, the calm she usually wore fracturing just a little. Daniel opened the door to find two serious-looking officers standing there, badges gleaming, their expressions professional but with a hint of scrutiny beneath. They identified themselves as USCIS agents, tasked with verifying the legitimacy of his marriage to Alina. Daniel's heart sank. This was the moment he had hoped would never come so soon, the test that could unravel everything. The agents asked to see identification, documentation, and most daunting of all, to speak with both of them privately. Alina stood close to Daniel. As they led her to the living room, her posture poised, her face composed, but Daniel caught a flicker of something behind her eyes, a flash of tension, perhaps even fear. The interview began with routine questions: how they met, how long they had known each other, details about their daily lives. Alina answered smoothly, her English accented but clear. She smiled politely, occasionally touching Daniel's arm, as if to remind both herself and the agents that this was a real union, a partnership built on more than just paperwork. The agents asked about her background, her work, her reasons for coming to America. She spoke carefully, giving just enough information to satisfy their inquiries, but never revealing too much. Daniel watched her closely, amazed at her ability to maintain such composure under pressure. The officers nodded and took notes, their questions probing but fair, searching for any signs of deceit or fabrication. Daniel found himself instinctively playing the part of a devoted husband, recounting small details about their routines, their conversations, and the times they spent together. He realized how much he had come to care about Alina, despite the transaction that had started their arrangement. When the agents finally left, the air in the house seemed to change. The tension hung thick, a fragile silence stretching between them. Alina excused herself and retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. Hours passed, and Daniel's attempts to reach her were met with quiet refusal. Then, late into the night, unable to sleep, he went outside to the backyard. There, beneath the pale glow of the moon, he found her sitting on the grass, wrapped in a blanket, her hands clutching something small and delicate. Her voice was low, barely audible as she whispered in her native tongue, words Daniel could not understand but that held the unmistakable cadence of sorrow. In her hands was a tiny sock, soft and worn, the kind made for a child no older than a toddler. Daniel's heart clenched. This simple object spoke volumes, a silent memorial to a life that had been ripped away, a daughter lost to forces beyond his understanding. He sat beside her quietly, offering what little comfort he could, feeling the fragile weight of her grief. For a long time they remained like that, two strangers bound by circumstance and secrets too painful to share openly. The next days were heavy with unspoken fears. Daniel noticed that Alina's once rigid distance softened, but the locks on her door remained, and the scarf, the photos, the hidden emails all took on new meaning. He realized this marriage was no longer about papers or money, but about survival, about protecting someone haunted by shadows he could barely glimpse. The visit from immigration had forced the hidden to surface, if only briefly, revealing the fragile threads that tied Alina's past to the uncertain present. Daniel's role was shifting, from a reluctant participant in a green card arrangement to a protector, a companion navigating a maze of dangers neither of them fully understood. And somewhere in the quiet moments between whispered prayers and stolen glances, he sensed the beginnings of trust, a fragile hope that, despite everything, they might find a way forward together. Days slipped into weeks in a slow, measured rhythm, and Daniel found himself increasingly aware of the fragile walls Alina had built around herself. She was polite, careful, never oversharing, and though she'd begun to relax just a little since the immigration visit, there was still an unspoken barrier between them, a chasm of secrets she was unwilling or unable to cross. One late afternoon, as Daniel tidied the modest bedroom she had claimed, he noticed something peculiar. A small drawer in Alina's dresser was slightly ajar, the kind of careless oversight that rarely happened with her meticulous nature. Curious, and perhaps looking for some connection to the woman who had so swiftly entered his life, he gently pulled it open. Inside, beneath a few folded garments, he spotted a crumpled piece of paper, its edges frayed and the ink faded in places. Without hesitation, he unfolded it carefully, revealing a letter typed in English but riddled with awkward phrasing and a clear struggle to find the right words. The letter was addressed to someone named Mara, and as Daniel read on, a cold knot tightened in his stomach. The letter was a plea, a desperate, trembling request for forgiveness. Alina begged Mara not to hold anger against her, explaining that her silence and absence had been necessary to keep them both safe. The writer warned Mara to stay hidden, to trust no one, and to avoid certain places. The letter's tone was frantic, each sentence dripping with fear and regret, as though penned under the weight of imminent danger. "They're watching again," the letter warned toward the end, the words smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled or been stained with tears. "I'm so sorry." Daniel's mind raced. Who was Mara? A sister? A friend? Or someone even more closely tied to Alina's past? And who were they? The watchers, the pursuers whose gaze was so threatening that Alina risked everything to keep Mara hidden. The letter felt like a fragment of a puzzle far larger than Daniel could have imagined when he had first agreed to this arrangement, when their marriage was simply a transaction. Now, it was a glimpse into a life entangled with fear, secrecy, and possibly danger. The realization was unsettling, but it also stirred something protective in Daniel, a fierce determination to shield Alina, no matter what shadows trailed her. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer, his thoughts spinning with questions he did not yet have answers to. That night, unable to shake the letter from his mind, Daniel sat by the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. He pondered the implications, weighing what he had learned against the woman he saw before him, reserved, sometimes distant, but undeniably vulnerable. The simple act of finding the letter had stripped away some of the distance between them. It forced him to acknowledge that Alina's life was far more complicated than he had assumed, layered with trauma and the kind of pain that left invisible scars. Over the following days, Daniel watched her closely, searching for signs of trust or a willingness to share. He noticed how she flinched at sudden noises, how she kept a watchful eye on the street, and how the small sock she clutched in the backyard remained a silent emblem of a child lost to circumstances neither of them dared speak of aloud. Yet Alina said nothing about the letter, neither confirming nor denying its existence when Daniel carefully broached the subject, choosing his words with care. Instead, she met his gaze with a quiet sadness, a storm of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. That silence was a language in itself, one that spoke of pain too deep to voice and secrets too dangerous to reveal. Daniel understood more than ever that trust could not be rushed or forced. It would come, if it came at all, in its own time. Meanwhile, the black SUV he had dismissed before had begun to appear more frequently, parked just out of sight but close enough to unsettle him. It was there when Alina left the house and gone when she returned, a silent sentinel lurking at the edge of their fragile sanctuary. One evening, when Daniel finally confronted her about it, his voice low with concern, she paled visibly. "Don't look at them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just don't." Her plea was urgent, desperate almost, and she begged him not to call the police. The weight of those words hung heavily between them, a stark reminder that the danger was very real and dangerously close. Daniel realized then that this was no ordinary marriage, no simple arrangement born of convenience. It was a battleground of trust, fear, and survival, where every moment held the potential for revelation or ruin. And at the center of it all was Alina, a woman cloaked in mystery, haunted by ghosts Daniel could only begin to understand but was determined to face alongside her. The letter in the drawer was not just a message, it was a warning and a call for help, a testament to the unseen battles fought in silence. As the days grew darker and the shadows lengthened, Daniel knew that whatever path lay ahead, he could no longer walk it alone. The transaction had ended. Now, something real and far more dangerous was beginning. The black SUV was impossible to ignore once Daniel truly noticed it. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, just another vehicle passing through the quiet Massachusetts neighborhood. But gradually, patterns emerged that made his skin crawl. The SUV, dark and nondescript, always appeared at the same times, parked just out of direct sight but close enough to feel like a shadow looming over the street. Daniel's unease grew each time Alina left the house. The vehicle was there, engine idling quietly or parked silently, waiting. At first he had dismissed the sighting, chalking it up to a local who preferred privacy or someone with business nearby. But there was nothing ordinary about the way the SUV lingered, always near whenever Alina stepped out. One evening, standing at the window, Daniel watched as she locked the front door and walked briskly to her car. As soon as she pulled away, the black SUV rolled forward from the shadows, headlights dimmed but unmistakably following her path. Daniel's heart pounded, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. This was no coincidence. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Alina was being watched, tracked, possibly hunted. He waited until she returned, her face pale, eyes darting nervously. "Who is that?" he asked quietly, trying to keep calm. Alina's response was immediate but terse. "Don't look at them. Don't call the police," she said, her voice shaking. "Please." She looked away, clutching the small sock she carried everywhere like a talisman. Daniel saw the fear etched deep in her expression, the kind of fear that runs bone deep and resists reason. His protective instinct surged, but so did confusion. Why wouldn't she want help? Why refuse the police when the threat was so clear? Over the next days, Daniel grew restless, watching the street from his kitchen window, noting the SUV's silent, steady presence. He started leaving the curtains open, making sure the vehicle could see he was watching back. When Alina asked why he was so tense, he only replied, "Because someone is following you, and I want to know why." At night, when the house settled into quiet, Daniel found Alina sitting in the backyard, whispering in her native language, clutching that tiny sock like a lifeline. Her voice was low, urgent, carrying words he couldn't understand but felt were prayers or pleas. She never looked up when he came outside, but she didn't stop. It was a ritual, a secret conversation with a past that refused to fade. Daniel wanted to bridge the gap between them, to reach through the silence that wrapped around her like a cocoon. One evening, summoning what courage he had, he sat beside her on the worn wooden bench beneath the maple tree. "Alina," he said softly, "who is watching you? What are they afraid of?" She turned her eyes toward him, then brimming with pain and exhaustion. "It's not just watching," she whispered. "It's hunting. They want to find me, to take me back." Daniel's throat tightened. The quiet town, the ordinary streets, they were no sanctuary. Alina's past had followed her across oceans and borders, and now it was here, in his home, in his life. Despite his worry, Daniel felt a growing determination. This was no longer just a contract marriage. It was a fight for survival, for freedom. He couldn't turn away even if the danger deepened. That night, Daniel lay awake, the letter he had found still fresh in his mind. The warnings, the pleas, the fear, they all connected with the black SUV parked silently outside. Someone was after Alina, but who? And why? The questions spun endlessly in his mind. He thought of Nadia, the daughter whose name was whispered in letters and dreams. If they were after Alina, what did that mean for the child? Was the danger tied to that fragile thread of hope, the promise of reunion? The next day, Daniel tried to broach the topic again, gently, carefully. "We need to be cautious. I'll help you, but you have to let me in. We have to be partners in this." Alina hesitated, her eyes searching his face for trust, for something real beneath the surface of their transaction. Finally, she nodded, just once, a small but significant gesture of surrender. Over the following weeks, Daniel began watching, more closely, noting the comings and goings around their street, tracking the SUV's movements. He installed new locks, set up small security cameras, and learned to drive with more awareness. He realized his life had shifted irreversibly, from a quiet, struggling man running a failing business to a guardian standing watch over a woman with a dangerous past. The neighbors whispered, curious about the strange marriage, the locked doors, the occasional late-night tensions. Daniel felt the weight of their eyes but pushed it aside. None of it mattered compared to the threat parked just down the road. One afternoon, Alina finally broke a piece of her silence, telling Daniel fragments of her story. She spoke in broken English, her voice thick with emotion. She had fled a country ruled by corruption and violence, where powerful men used fear as currency. Her daughter, Nadia, had been taken from her by those men connected to a businessman whose influence stretched far beyond borders. Alina escaped alone, leaving Nadia behind with a promise to find her again. But someone had followed her, tracking her every move. The black SUV was a constant reminder that the past was never far away. Daniel listened, absorbing every word with growing resolve. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. This was not simply about green cards or convenient arrangements. This was about survival, redemption, and a fight for a future that seemed more fragile than ever. As the days shortened and winter approached, Daniel and Alina became allies in an invisible war. He taught her how to navigate this new reality, how to watch, how to protect, how to prepare. They were no longer strangers sharing a contract. They were partners bound by fear and hope alike. And the man in the black SUV was a reminder that their story had only just begun. The late autumn air had grown colder, and the sun dipped behind the distant hills earlier each evening. Daniel found himself pacing the living room more often than not, the knot of worry tightening in his chest with every passing day. Alina had begun to open up, but only in fragments, pieces of a puzzle so complex and dark it made Daniel's head spin. One night after dinner, Daniel sat beside her on the threadbare couch, the orange glow from the fireplace casting flickering shadows across their faces. Alina's eyes, usually so guarded, seemed tired, as if carrying the weight of years in their depths. She clutched the small worn sock, Nadia's sock he had come to understand, and finally began to speak, her voice low and hesitant, like a frightened bird testing the wind. "I was a translator," she said almost in a whisper, "for a man in power, a corrupt diplomat. He used his influence for terrible things, trafficking, bribery, silencing voices." Daniel listened intently, the pieces of mystery falling slowly into place. "I worked for him because I had no choice. I translated his orders, his lies. But one day I found something, evidence. I took it. I hid it." Her fingers tightened around the sock. "They found out. They took my daughter, Nadia, to keep me quiet." The room was silent, but for the crackle of the fire. Daniel swallowed, hard, realizing the danger far outweighed anything he'd imagined when he'd first agreed to the green card arrangement. This was no simple immigration case or family dispute. It was a nightmare rooted in political corruption, human trafficking, and a desperate mother's fight for her child. Alina's face was pale, the resolve beneath her fear unmistakable. "I escaped with nothing but hope. Hope to find her again." Her gaze locked onto Daniel's. "I asked you to marry me because it was my last chance. To live here. To survive long enough to find help." Daniel felt a surge of guilt, remembering his initial motives, how this had all been a business deal for him. Now sitting beside her, feeling the raw pain and courage, he knew he had to do more than just protect his own interests. He had to protect her. For the first time, Alina allowed him to see beyond the walls she had built, a glimpse of a mother's fierce love and desperate hope. The following days blurred into a quiet urgency. Daniel took on the role of protector with a new intensity. He taught Alina how to navigate the small American town, introduced her to safe places, and helped her find under-the-table work cleaning offices at night. He sensed her isolation, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her eyes darted to every shadow. She never stopped clutching that sock. They began to build something fragile yet real, a partnership forged not by contract, but by shared fear and growing trust. Still, the black SUV's presence loomed like a dark cloud. One afternoon, Daniel spotted it parked near the local grocery store as Alina hurried inside. His heart pounded. This was no longer just a threat at home. It followed her everywhere. When she returned, he confronted her gently. "They're watching you, Alina. We can't keep living like this." She looked exhausted, her face a mask of worry and resignation. "I don't know what they want exactly," she admitted, "but they will never stop. Not until they get the evidence or silence me." Daniel felt the weight of her words sink, and this was bigger than either of them. The corrupt diplomat, the stolen files, Nadia's disappearance, they were tangled in a web far beyond his quiet life of construction and small-town routine. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Daniel found Alina sitting alone in the backyard, whispering again in her native tongue. This time he didn't interrupt. Instead, he watched her, understanding that her prayers and murmurs were her way of holding on to hope amid despair. Gradually, Alina shared more details, snippets of her past life, the betrayal of those she once trusted, the constant fear of being caught. She told Daniel about the businessman's men, their cold efficiency, the way they took Nadia from her arms without a trace. I was powerless, she said, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. But I kept a promise. I will find her. Daniel's heart ached for her. He thought about his own daughter years ago and the hollow ache of lost time. This was no longer just a story about escape. It was about justice, about fighting the shadows to reclaim a stolen light. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Daniel and Alina's relationship deepened. What had started as a transactional marriage evolved into something fragile and precious. They shared fears and small victories, like the way Alina's English improved or how she began to smile more often. Yet beneath it all, the past lingered like a storm on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. One night, Daniel found Alina staring at a tattered photograph of a small girl, Nadia. Her fingers traced the image softly. "She's waiting for me," Alina whispered, "and I will bring her home." Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his. "We'll find her together," he promised. In that quiet moment, the contract was forgotten. They were no longer two strangers bound by convenience, but allies against an unseen enemy. And though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, hope had taken root in their hearts. A fragile but fierce hope that one day Nadia would be found and the past could finally be put to rest. The weeks that followed marked a subtle but profound shift in Daniel and Alina's relationship. What began as an arrangement born of convenience and necessity was evolving, quietly, into something neither had expected. Daniel found himself drawn to Alina not just out of obligation or pity, but from a genuine desire to protect and understand the woman who had carried such burdens on her shoulders. There was a certain tenderness in their interactions, a growing familiarity that seemed to soften the edges of their guarded lives. It started with small gestures, Daniel helping her navigate the labyrinth of grocery stores and banks, patiently teaching her the names of everyday objects and American customs. He found himself explaining the oddities of this small New England town, from the way the leaves turned brilliant colors in fall to the slow, comforting rhythms of the community's yearly festivals. Alina, in turn, shared bits of her culture with him, the recipes of her homeland, stories from a childhood far away, songs she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. One chilly afternoon, Daniel brought home a battered second-hand car, barely more than a rusty frame with a motor, but it was enough. He spent evenings tinkering under the hood, teaching Alina how to drive. It was a clumsy process, filled with nervous laughter and occasional near misses, but each successful turn behind the wheel was a victory for her, a step toward independence. Watching her gain confidence, Daniel felt a warmth that had long been absent from his life. The loneliness that had gnawed at him since his divorce began to ebb, replaced by a protective instinct that was both new and unexpected. Yet, despite the growing closeness, the shadows of Alina's past remained ever present. She still kept her bedroom door locked, her phone close at hand. She was wary of the neighbors' curious glances, and Daniel sensed the tension simmering beneath her calm exterior. Sometimes, late at night, he would find her standing by the window, eyes scanning the quiet street as if expecting someone or something to appear. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the first snowflakes began to fall, Daniel suggested she find a job to help her feel more grounded, to build a life beyond their small house. He arranged a cleaning position at a local office building through an acquaintance who owed him a favor. It was a modest start, but for Alina, it meant a chance to step into the world on her own terms, even if just for a few hours a day. She was nervous at first, uncertain how to interact with colleagues or navigate the complexities of American work culture. But with Daniel's encouragement and patience, she gradually settled into a routine. Each morning before work, Daniel would make her coffee, a small ritual that became a symbol of their growing partnership. They ate dinner together whenever possible, sharing stories, fears, and plans. The pretense of their arrangement began to blur, replaced by something genuine, fragile but real. Their nights, however, remained largely separate, a silent acknowledgement of the distance still between them. But even here, small cracks began to appear. One evening, after a long day, Daniel found Alina sitting on the edge of her bed. The door, unlocked for the first time. They talked for hours, about her past, the daughter she longed to find, the danger that lurked just beyond the safety of their walls. She confessed her nightmares, the moments when fear overwhelmed hope and the weight of living under constant watch. Daniel listened, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was now part of a story far larger than he had ever imagined. He held her hand as she cried softly, offering comfort without words. Outside, the black SUV still lurked in the shadows, a silent reminder that their peace was fragile. Daniel saw the toll it took on Alina, the way she flinched at every sound, how she jumped at a passing car's headlights. He knew the danger was real and immediate, yet amid the fear and uncertainty there was a growing bond between them, a connection forged in adversity and shared purpose. One chilly November morning, Daniel awoke early and found Alina in the kitchen, sipping tea and staring out at the frost-covered lawn. The house was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock and the soft hum of the heater. He sat beside her, feeling the steady beat of her pulse beneath his fingers. "We're more than just a marriage now," he said quietly. She looked at him, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, a fragile hope, a tentative trust. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but with you, I feel stronger. Maybe this can be real." Daniel nodded, knowing that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time, he believed in the possibility of a future where they were not just strangers bound by a contract, but partners facing the world together. The days grew colder, and the snow began to blanket the quiet town, muffling sounds and softening the edges of their lives. In the warmth of their modest home, Daniel and Alina found moments of peace, small victories against the storm that threatened to engulf them. As Alina prepared for work, Daniel kissed her forehead, a silent promise to protect her in the hope that one day they would find Nadia and build a family beyond fear. The real marriage was beginning, not one forged in legal papers, but in shared fears, fragile trust, and the slow, steady building of a life together. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Daniel decided to tackle some long-overdue repairs in the attic. The house had its creaks and quirks, a testament to years of weather and wear, and the attic was no exception, dusty, cramped, and cluttered with forgotten relics from previous owners. He climbed the narrow wooden ladder, the sunlight filtering weakly through a small window near the roof, casting pale, shifting shadows on the clutter beneath his feet. Alina had mentioned once, almost casually, that she had brought an old lamp with her when she arrived, a small, intricate piece from her homeland, worn but clearly cherished. It sat atop a rickety shelf, its brass surface dulled by time. Daniel had never paid it much attention until that day. Something about the lamp caught his eye as he moved boxes and old furniture, and curiosity pulled him closer. As he inspected the lamp, he noticed a small panel at its base that seemed out of place, almost like a secret compartment. His fingers worked carefully, prying it open, and to his surprise, inside lay a small USB flash drive, tucked carefully as if hidden from someone's prying eyes. He held it in his hand for a moment, heart quickening with questions. Why hadn't Alina told him about this? What was on it? The rest of the attic chores forgotten, Daniel hurried downstairs, locking the door behind him, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. Alina was out, at work, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. He inserted the USB drive, and a folder appeared immediately, labeled in Cyrillic characters. Some files required passwords, locked behind layers of encryption, but one folder opened easily. Inside, Daniel found a collection of photographs, scanned documents, and maps, all marked with names and annotations also in Cyrillic. The images were startling, portraits of men and women, many dressed in formal suits, some with badges or pins that suggested political or diplomatic status. Maps showed regions of Eastern Europe, with certain areas circled or highlighted in red. Names he couldn't pronounce were scribbled next to these marks alongside dates and brief notes. As he sifted through the files, a chilling realization settled over him. This was no ordinary collection of personal photos or travel mementos. This was intelligence, evidence of something dangerous and secret. The files spoke of political dealings, covert operations, and shadowy figures moving behind closed doors. A sense of dread crept up his spine. Suddenly, the distant worries about Alina's mysterious past and the men who had been watching her began to make grim sense. This was more than just a custody dispute or a desperate escape. It was espionage, and Alina had been caught in the middle. When Alina returned home later that evening, Daniel was waiting for her at the kitchen table, the USB drive sitting between them like an unspoken accusation. Her eyes widened the moment she saw it. She said nothing at first, her hands trembling, slightly as she reached for her tea. Then quietly she began to speak, slowly, carefully, as if weighing every word. She confessed that the files were proof she had stolen from dangerous people back home, evidence of corruption, trafficking, and political cover-ups involving a powerful diplomat. Her work as a translator had given her access to these secrets, and when she uncovered the truth, she had tried to expose it. But those she crossed were ruthless. They had taken her daughter Nadia as leverage, forcing Alina into silence and submission. Her escape to America had been her last desperate attempt to survive, to find safety, and one day, to reunite with her child. Daniel listened, the pieces falling into place, the enormity of her plight finally clear. He understood why she had kept so much from him, why she had been so guarded. Fear was not just in her eyes, it was etched into every moment of her life. Together they realized the danger was far from over. The men watching her, the black SUV parked suspiciously nearby, they were part of a network intent on retrieving what she had taken and silencing her forever. Daniel's protective instincts surged stronger than ever. They agreed to keep the USB drive safe, hidden until they could find a way to use it as leverage for Nadia's rescue. But the risk was immense. If anyone discovered the files, or if Alina was forced to talk, their lives could be shattered. As they sat in the dim kitchen light, a fragile partnership formed not just of convenience but of necessity, trust, and a shared hope that the truth might yet set them free. The forgotten USB drive had changed everything. It was a key to the mystery, a symbol of danger but also a beacon of hope. In that quiet house beneath the falling snow outside, Daniel and Alina prepared to face whatever came next, together. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension, a fragile silence lingering between Daniel and Alina, like a thin veil barely holding back the storm. Each time Daniel glanced at her, he saw traces of exhaustion in her eyes, shadows deeper than those cast by the evening light. She was no longer just the woman who had come into his life with a quiet distance. She had become a puzzle he needed to solve, a story he felt compelled to hear in full. One night, as they sat in the small living room, illuminated only by a flickering lamp, Alina finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, tremulous but steady as she began to unravel the threads of her past. She told Daniel about her former life, the danger she had fled, and the invisible chains that still bound her heart. Alina had once been a translator for a diplomat, one who was powerful, influential, and corrupt beyond measure. His name was spoken with cautious fear even in her soft accent. This man was involved in unspeakable crimes, including human trafficking, networks that stretched across borders, hidden beneath layers of political immunity. Alina's role had been to interpret, to bridge languages and cultures, but what she had uncovered went far beyond anything she expected. She had come across documents, recordings, and messages implicating this man and his associates in atrocities that shook her very soul. As the truth revealed itself, she made a choice that would change everything. She stole evidence, risking her life and the safety of her family. Her daughter, Nadia, became a pawn in a cruel game, a leverage against her silence, a promise of pain should she betray those dark forces? The diplomat's men had taken Nadia away, a ruthless act meant to keep Alina under control. When she fled her homeland, she did so alone, clinging to the hope that she might one day find a way to bring her daughter to safety. The green card marriage with Daniel was a last desperate measure, a lifeline thrown to her in a sea of despair. Hearing this, Daniel's earlier frustrations and doubts melted into a profound empathy. He saw the courage beneath her guarded exterior, the resilience masked by her quiet tears. This was no longer a transactional arrangement. It was a partnership forged in the crucible of fear and hope. The secret files, the black SUV, the locked doors, all pieces of a sinister puzzle. But Alina's story did not end there. She explained how her past had followed her across the ocean, how the men who sought to silence her had managed to track her movements despite the miles and borders between them. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where any misstep could mean disaster. Daniel, who had once seen the marriage as a simple business deal, found himself deeply entwined in Alina's fight for survival and redemption. He realized that protecting her meant more than shielding her from legal troubles. It meant standing by her through every shadow and threat that loomed over their fragile existence. They began to plan cautiously, weighing their options and considering the risks. Alina wanted to expose the truth, to bring the evidence to those who could act. Daniel knew that doing so would invite dangers that could upend their lives completely. Yet the thought of Nadia, still out there somewhere, drove them forward with a fierce determination neither had anticipated. Over the following weeks, Daniel taught Alina the rhythms of everyday American life, how to drive, how to navigate the city's small routines, how to blend in without drawing attention. He helped her find work discreetly, jobs that would not jeopardize her visa status or put her in harm's way. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. They shared quiet dinners, whispered conversations, and moments of unexpected laughter that felt like small victories against the weight of their shared fears. It was in these moments that the real marriage began to take shape, not one born of convenience or desperation, but one formed from mutual respect, care, and the fragile beginnings of trust. Still, the dark cloud of Nadia's absence hung over them like an unrelenting shadow. Each night, Alina would whisper her daughter's name softly, tears slipping down her cheeks in the solitude of their home. Daniel found himself unable to look away, his heart breaking for a woman who had lost so much yet fought so fiercely. Together, they faced the harsh reality that their lives had been forever altered by forces far beyond their control. Yet in the face of that, they clung to each other as a lifeline. The ties that bound them were no longer just legal or practical. They were deeply human, forged in the fires of pain, hope, and the unyielding desire to reclaim what had been lost. As the snow began to fall again outside their window, covering the world in a quiet, cold blanket, Daniel and Alina sat side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The fight for Nadia, for justice, and for a future that might finally bring peace was just beginning. But this time they would not face it alone. The weight of Alina's confession settled over Daniel like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts but sharpening his resolve. In the quiet that followed, the room seemed smaller, the walls closer, as if the very space between them contracted under the gravity of what lay ahead. Daniel had come into this arrangement with the simple intention of a green card marriage, an exchange of convenience. But now, everything had changed. This was no longer a transaction. It was a question of survival, of morality, of the kind of man he wanted to be. Alina sat beside him, her fingers tightly entwined in his, the usual distance between them erased by the vulnerability she had just revealed. "You have to understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If these files get into the wrong hands, if I'm caught again, it's not just me who pays. Nadia?" Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her lips trembling as she spoke the name of the daughter she had not seen in years. Daniel swallowed hard. The thought of a little girl, stolen and hidden in some shadowy place, sent a pang through his chest he had never known before. He felt a fierce protectiveness awaken inside him, one that had little to do with the original bargain they'd made. Alina's plan was desperate yet clear. She intended to deliver the files to federal authorities, people she hoped could act swiftly and secretly to dismantle the network her former employer had built. But to do so meant putting herself in the crosshairs again, risking not only deportation but potentially far worse consequences. When Daniel voiced his fears, she shook her head, a fierce determination flashing in her eyes. "I will do it alone," she said firmly. "You don't have to be involved. It's safer that way." But Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "No, you're not alone anymore." It was the first time he spoke with the full weight of his heart, a conviction, so deep it surprised even him. She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time he saw the walls she'd built around herself crumble in that moment. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, a flood long held back by fear and sorrow. He held her as she cried, feeling the fragile thread of their bond tighten and strengthen all at once. In that embrace, something shifted. The deal of convenience was gone. In its place was a partnership of trust and shared fate. Together, they began to weigh their options. Daniel reached out to his old army buddy, Mark, a man he had lost touch with over the years but who now worked in federal law enforcement. Mark was someone Daniel trusted, a steady hand in a world suddenly rife with danger. He called him discreetly, explaining the situation without revealing too much, aware that even the wrong words could be intercepted. Mark listened carefully, his tone grave but professional. He agreed to help, arranging a meeting at a secure government location where the files could be handed over safely. The plan was fraught with risk. The black SUV that had begun to haunt their neighborhood, the strange men who seemed to watch, Alina's every move, all were signs that their enemies were close and vigilant. Daniel and Alina knew they would have to be careful, to move quickly and with caution. The day of the meeting arrived under a cold, gray sky, the kind that presses down on the soul with its heaviness. Daniel drove with Alina beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The tension in the car was palpable, the silence filled with unspoken fears and hopes. As they approached the meeting point, a sleek black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror, tailing them with a persistence that made Daniel's heart pound. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes flicking to the side mirror again and again, watching as the vehicle mirrored their every turn. The chase began suddenly, a burst of adrenaline flooding Daniel's veins as he pushed the car faster, down narrow streets and winding roads. Alina gripped the door handle, her knuckles white but her face was resolute, eyes fixed ahead. Just as the black SUV tried to cut them off, flashing lights appeared behind, and the sound of sirens pierced the air. Police cars swarmed in, blocking the pursuer's path. 2 men were arrested on the spot, their faces grim but defeated. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him like a warm tide. The files were safe, the handoff complete. But even in the aftermath, the danger remained real. They knew this was only the beginning of a longer battle, one fought in courtrooms, safe houses, and quiet moments of waiting. That night, back at the small house that now felt more like a refuge than ever, Daniel and Alina sat close, their exhaustion giving way to a fragile peace. The decision they had made together was more than a choice. It was a promise to face whatever came next, side by side. Nadia's fate still hung in the balance, but hope, once so elusive, now flickered brightly in their hearts. In the quiet darkness, as snow fell softly outside the window, Daniel whispered, "We'll find her. We'll bring her home." And Alina, for the first time since arriving in this country, smiled, not out of relief, but out of the fierce certainty that she was no longer alone in her fight. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a heavy yet determined heart. The events of the previous night still lingered vividly in his mind. The black car tailing them, the distant wail of sirens, and the chaotic moments that had erupted, then faded, like a violent storm passing through. But more importantly, he knew the real battle was only just beginning. Alina lay beside him, still sleeping, her face carrying traces of exhaustion yet an unusual peacefulness. Daniel looked at her with protective eyes, thoughts of her daughter Nadia filling his mind, making it impossible to look away from the fragile yet strong woman. He silently promised himself he would not let those dangerous men harm her, nor allow fear to extinguish their hope. After a quiet breakfast, they decided not to wait any longer. Alina's story was not just a dangerous secret. It was the only light that could save Nadia from the shadowy past that threatened to swallow her whole. Daniel called Mark, an old friend working in federal investigations, and they agreed to meet at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the city's noise. Mark arrived quickly, his expression serious and his sharp eyes like those of a wolf. He carried a black bag filled with documents, technical gadgets, and tools necessary for their upcoming mission. "We've confirmed the existence of an international human trafficking ring linked to Alina's former company," Mark said bluntly. "But to dismantle this network, we need more evidence and tighter coordination with security agencies." Daniel nodded, realizing the responsibility did not lie. With Alina alone, it was theirs. His presence was no longer accidental. It was part of a shared determination to end the evil that had thrived for too long. They began drawing up a detailed plan, assigning clear roles. Daniel would support Alina in moving safely and gathering intelligence, while Mark would coordinate with external agencies to broaden the investigation's scope. In the following days, their lives revolved around secrecy and danger. Alina constantly changed locations to avoid surveillance, while Daniel learned to be alert to every subtle sound, every strange glance on the streets. One rainy afternoon, while walking in a park near their safe house, Daniel noticed a shift in Alina's eyes. Gone was the fear and worry, replaced by a burning resolve. "We can't save Nadia by waiting," she said quietly. "She needs us, a light to guide her out of the darkness." Daniel fell silent, her words igniting a torch of hope within him stronger than ever before. Time was running out, and their enemies lurked behind, ready to strike at any moment. They knew they were playing a dangerous game, but the only choice was to keep moving forward, never looking back. During a secret meeting with a crucial witness, Daniel and Alina received vital information about a hidden warehouse where the hostages, including Nadia, might be held. Daniel's heart pounded wildly. He could almost reach out and touch the daughter he had never imagined becoming part of his story. But time was relentless. They planned a nighttime raid on the warehouse, coordinating with Mark's special task force. Every second was tense, filled with fear and hope intertwined. As the warehouse doors creaked open, Daniel and Alina stepped into the oppressive silence. Faint footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, making their hearts nearly stop. Then a choked scream, a tight embrace, a tear tracing down a cheek. Nadia was back. The story wasn't over, but the first light piercing the darkness shone brightly, rekindling faith and newfound strength for all three. Daniel knew that although challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. For family was not just blood, but brave decisions and hearts beating as one. The days that followed the raid on the warehouse felt like a strange dream to Daniel, Alina, and Nadia, a dream slowly turning into reality. Weeks of silence had stretched between them, heavy with uncertainty and cautious hope, until one quiet morning broke through with the sharp ring of a phone. Alina's hands trembled as she answered, her voice barely a whisper at first, then growing stronger as the words came. Nadia was alive, safe in a secure house overseas, protected by people who had been watching and waiting just as anxiously as they had. The relief that flooded Daniel's chest was so overwhelming it nearly left him breathless. After years of pain and fear, the fragile thread connecting mother and daughter had not broken. It was time to rebuild what had been shattered, to reclaim a family lost to shadow and silence. Arrangements were made quickly but discreetly. Under the guidance of Mark and other trusted officials, Daniel and Alina prepared to fly abroad with new identities. Their lives forever altered, but their purpose clear. The journey itself was filled with a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Alina, who had once been so guarded and distant, now showed flickers of a softer light. Moments of laughter, a spark of genuine warmth as they talked quietly about the future. Daniel found himself imagining what that future might look like. Small joys and simple comforts after years of running and hiding. When they finally arrived at the safe house, the reunion was quiet, yet deeply soul-shaking. Nadia, now a young girl with wide, curious eyes and a cautious smile, stepped forward slowly, reaching out to her mother with a hesitant but undeniable longing. Alina's tears came freely then, her arms wrapping tightly around the daughter she had feared lost forever. Daniel watched from a few steps away, heart swelling with a mix of awe and tenderness. He had never imagined that this strange, transactional marriage would lead to something so profoundly real. In that moment, the walls, built from fear and necessity, crumbled, replaced by a fragile but genuine family bond. As they spent days together sharing stories and healing old wounds, Daniel saw the strength that had always lived within Alina, the courage to face darkness, and the hope to find light beyond it. Nadia's presence brought a new sense of peace, a promise that despite everything, life could still be rebuilt, love could still grow. Yet beneath the joy, a quiet vigilance remained. Their enemies had not disappeared, the past still cast long shadows, reminding them that safety was fragile and must be guarded fiercely. But together, Daniel, Alina, and Nadia were ready to face whatever came next. With the support of federal protection and a network of allies, they began to plan their return home, knowing that true freedom required more than distance. It required courage, resilience, and the willingness to keep moving forward. The flight back to the United States was filled with hopeful silence, a shared understanding that the journey had only just begun. Arriving in a small New Hampshire town under asylum protection, the family found a quiet refuge where Nadia could start school, where Alina could rebuild her life, and where Daniel could finally call this place home. Their new beginning was not without challenges, but each day brought renewed strength and the quiet joy of belonging. As winter's snow fell gently outside their window, Daniel looked around at the life they had forged. Not perfect, but real and deeply meaningful. What had started as a deal born of desperation had blossomed into a true partnership, a real marriage built on trust, love, and the fierce determination to protect what mattered most. In the stillness of that snowy evening, Daniel smiled, feeling a peace he had never known before. A fake marriage had given him a real family, and with it, the promise of hope, healing, and a future worth fighting for. Months had slipped by since the fragile reunion in that quiet safe house overseas, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at times, the pieces of Daniel, Alina, and Nadia's lives began to knit themselves back together. Returning to the United States, under the protective umbrella of asylum, was a delicate process, but one that brought a profound sense of relief. Mingled with a cautious optimism, they arrived in a sleepy New Hampshire town tucked away from the bustling cities and sharp eyes of the world that had once hunted them. Here, beneath the towering evergreens and soft powdery snows, they found a quiet refuge where healing could begin without fear. The town itself seemed to breathe a different kind of peace, the kind born from generations who had weathered harsh winters and long nights, holding on to hope even when the world seemed cold and unforgiving. It was in this landscape of stillness that Alina and Daniel made their decision to remarry, not out of convenience or obligation, but out of the genuine, deep affection that had grown through shared struggle and the relentless pursuit of safety and family. The ceremony was small and intimate, a humble celebration filled with quiet smiles and steady hands. The guests were few, trusted friends who had become more like family in the most unexpected of ways. Alina's eyes shone with a softness that Daniel had never seen before, a look that spoke of a future no longer shrouded in shadows. Nadia, now old enough to understand the significance, stood beside them, her small hand nestled in Alina's, her face lighting up with the innocent joy of belonging. School was the next chapter for Nadia, and the quiet town offered her a chance to step into a new world without the weight of fear or uncertainty. The teachers welcomed her warmly, the children were curious but kind, and for the first time in many years Nadia's laughter was not tinged with hesitation or pain. Daniel watched as she blossomed, finding friends, discovering new interests, and slowly reclaiming the childhood stolen from her by forces beyond her control. For Alina, the transition was both a relief and a challenge. The scars of her past were not easily forgotten, but the daily routines, grocery runs, quiet mornings sipping coffee, evenings spent cooking meals together, wove a new rhythm into her life, one grounded in safety and the small, enduring joys of home. She found work at a local community center, helping others who had faced hardship, drawing strength from their stories just as they found hope in hers. Daniel, too, found a measure of peace in the steady predictability of this new life. His construction business, once teetering on the edge of collapse, began to stabilize. With Alina's quiet encouragement and Nadia's bright presence at home, he found motivation that had long been buried beneath worries and regrets. They invested in a modest renovation of their house, turning it into a sanctuary that reflected the warmth and resilience of their family. Yet even as snow blanketed the streets and the holidays came and went with gentle familiarity, the past lingered at the edges of their lives like a distant storm cloud. There were moments late at night or in quiet pauses when Alina's gaze would harden and Daniel would see the flicker of old fears behind her eyes. The black SUV, the men who once followed them, the stolen secrets buried in that forgotten flash drive, they were never far from memory. But those shadows had lost their power, diminished by the strength they had found in one another and the promise of a future reclaimed. Together, they learned to live with the echoes, turning them into reminders of how far they had come rather than chains that held them back. The local community grew to embrace them not as outsiders but as neighbors, people who had endured hardship and emerged with a quiet dignity that inspired respect and compassion. Thanksgiving dinners were shared with new friends, neighborhood. Walks became a daily ritual, and the simple act of planting a garden in their backyard felt like an act of hope itself. Daniel often caught himself marveling at the unexpected journey that had brought them here. What began as a cold, transactional marriage had blossomed into a genuine partnership forged in the fires of adversity. The real marriage, the one built on trust, love, and a fierce determination to protect their family, had taken root in the most unlikely of places. On clear nights when the stars glittered against the vast dark sky, Daniel would sit on the porch with Alina by his side, their hands intertwined, and Nadia's soft breathing echoing from inside the house. The past, with all its pain and danger, had shaped them but no longer defined them. The future stretched out before them, uncertain yet filled with the quiet promise of peace. As the first snowflakes of winter drifted lazily down, settling gently on the ground, Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth deep within his chest. In the heart of a small town far from the shadows they once fled, they had found something real, something enduring, a home, a family, and a chance at a life reborn. The fake marriage that began in desperation had given way to a real love, a true family bond that would carry them forward through whatever storms might come. And in that moment, as the cold wind whispered softly through the trees, Daniel knew with certainty that they were home again for real. Life settled into a rhythm that Daniel, Alina, and Nadia had only dared to imagine during those long years of uncertainty. Each day brought its own quiet victories, Nadia's laughter echoing down the school hallways, Alina's gentle smile greeting neighbors, Daniel's steady hands repairing the creaky floors of their home. The seasons shifted around them, painting the town in vibrant colors in autumn, then soft white in winter, then awakening green in spring. Yet beneath this calm surface, something deeper was stirring, a yearning not just to survive, but to truly live. Daniel found himself reflecting on the transformation not only of their circumstances but of themselves. The man who had once been a reluctant participant in a desperate marriage had grown into a devoted father and husband. His love for Alina was no longer a fragile thread, but a strong, unbreakable bond, forged through shared trials and nurtured by everyday acts of kindness and understanding. Alina, too, blossomed in this new chapter. The shadows that had once clung to her began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence and a fierce protectiveness over her family. She poured herself into her work at the community center, where her empathy, And resilience became a beacon for others who faced hardship. Helping others heal gave her a sense of purpose that illuminated even the darkest memories of her past. Nadia thrived amid this newfound stability. The child who had once carried the weight of fear now embraced childhood with wide eyes and an open heart. Her school performances, weekend adventures in the woods, and late-night stories read aloud by Alina filled the house with joy. Daniel watched her grow with a mixture of pride and awe, marveling at her resilience and the bright future ahead. But life, as always, held moments of unexpected challenge. The past, though distant, was never fully gone. One chilly autumn evening, as Daniel was locking up the workshop, a familiar shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. For a moment his heart clenched. The black SUV, the quiet menace that had haunted their flight, only to dissolve into the gathering dusk. He realized then that while danger had passed, vigilance remained a part of their lives. This awareness only deepened their commitment to protect their fragile peace. The community that had once greeted them with cautious curiosity now embraced them as family. Neighbors dropped by with homemade pies, friends invited them to town events, and Nadia's school friends often stayed for dinner, filling the house with laughter and the noise of normalcy. The trio discovered the profound power of connection, a lifeline after years of isolation. As winter's chill gave way to spring's promise, Daniel and Alina began making plans for the future. Dreams once whispered in the dark, now spoken aloud with hope. They talked about expanding the house, perhaps planting a garden big enough for Nadia to run freely, maybe even adopting a dog. Each plan was a step further from the shadows of their past and closer to a life filled with light. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Alina shared a story about her childhood dreams of traveling, of creating art, of a life where fear no longer dictated her choices. Daniel listened, his heart swelling with love and determination. Together they vowed to nurture those dreams, not just for themselves, but for Nadia, whose innocence deserved to flourish. Their bond grew stronger with each shared secret, every quiet moment of understanding, weaving a tapestry of trust and hope. They learned to celebrate the small things, morning coffees together, whispered goodnights, the comfort of simply being near one another. This was the true essence of family, a sanctuary built not just of bricks and mortar, but of unwavering love. Yet even amid this tranquility, the world beyond their town continued to turn, reminding them that life's uncertainties never fully disappear. Letters arrived from distant friends who had helped them, updates on the political upheavals that had forced their flight, reminders that freedom and safety were precious, fragile gifts. These reminders only strengthened their resolve to cherish every peaceful moment. Nadia, now thriving in school and blossoming socially, asked questions about her past that neither Daniel nor Alina had fully prepared for. They answered with gentle honesty, balancing truth with protection, nurturing her understanding while shielding her from unnecessary pain. These conversations, difficult yet necessary, deepened their family's connection, affirming their commitment to face the future together. As summer approached, the family planned a trip to the nearby coast, a celebration of life and new beginnings. The salty air, the endless horizon, the sound of waves crashing against rocks, all served as a metaphor for their journey. Daniel watched Alina and Nadia play in the surf, their faces lit with pure joy, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. This trip symbolized more than a vacation. It was a testament to survival, love, and hope. In the quiet moments of reflection, Daniel often thought back to the man he had been before, the one defined by fear, loss, and desperation. That man seemed a lifetime away. Today he was a husband, a father, a man who had reclaimed his life and rewritten his story. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had led him here, to this moment of peace and possibility. As the sun set over the ocean, casting golden hues across the water, Daniel held Alina's hand tightly. Nadia's laughter mingled with the wind, a melody of hope that filled the air. They were no longer fugitives or strangers, but a family bound by love, resilience, and the promise of a new chapter unfolding. And with that promise, they stepped forward together, ready to face whatever the future might bring. And so, their story, born from silence, loss, and long-buried secrets, transformed into one of healing, hope, and quiet triumph. It reminds us that even after the darkest storms, light finds a way back in, especially when love holds steady through the chaos. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. Your time, your attention, and your heart mean more than words can say. If this story touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and most importantly, leaving a comment below, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or even your own story. We read every single one, and your voice truly matters here. Let's keep growing this community of listeners who believe in the power of storytelling, healing, and human connection. See you in the next story.